People often believe they are held back by a certain person, a particular memory, or an event that happened in the past. But after observing the inner life of the psyche for a long time, Carl Jung arrived at a very different insight. What truly keeps a person stuck is not the event itself, but the way the ego identifies with the images that live inside the mind. Once the ego attaches itself to a certain image, that image begins to function as a center of psychological life. Thoughts, emotions, and even the way a person sees themselves slowly begin to revolve around it. For this reason, when a relationship ends, or when a role in life disappears, the disturbance people feel is not only about the external loss. What is far more difficult to accept is the instability that appears in the structure of identity they have built around that experience. In Jung's language, the ego always tries to preserve its sense of continuity, even when the structure it is protecting has become narrow or painful. This is why many people keep returning to the same story in their minds. They do not do this because they want to suffer, but because the ego depends on familiarity in order to maintain its sense of stability. What many people do not expect is that real detachment does not begin by understanding the past more and more. It begins with a deeper shift in the relationship between the ego and the unconscious images that influence it. When psychological energy is no longer continuously feeding the same old structure, the attachment gradually loses its weight. And when that shift becomes clear enough, letting go can happen so quickly that even you may be surprised by the change within yourself. Part 1. Withdraw psychic energy from the image that binds you. In Carl Jung's psychology, no inner state survives simply because an event once happened. A memory by itself has no power to sustain its own existence in the present. What keeps it alive in the mind is the psychological energy that consciousness continues to pour into it, often quietly and without noticing. Every time you return to the past in your thoughts to analyze what happened, every time you dissect the situation to see where you went wrong, every time you rearrange the story again in search of a more satisfying explanation, you are doing something most people never realize. You are refueling an image that already belongs to the past. That image is like a small coal still glowing beneath a layer of ash. If no fresh air reaches it, it will slowly fade out on its own. But each time consciousness returns to it through repetitive thinking, it is as if you are blowing oxygen back into that ember. And because of that, the fire never fully dies. Many people believe they are healing simply because they are thinking a great deal about their pain. Yet in many cases, what is actually happening is not healing at all. It is a form of maintenance. From Jung's perspective, when a memory, an emotion, or a personal story is repeated too many times in consciousness, it stops being a passing mental event. It begins to turn into a center of gravity within the psyche. Like a large planet inside a solar system, it slowly starts pulling other thoughts, other emotions, and even your sense of identity into its orbit. Gradually, your psychological life begins to organize itself around that point without you realizing it. For that reason, what imprisons many people is not entirely the event that once took place. That event has long since ended. What continues to exist is the relationship your consciousness is still maintaining with the unconscious image of that event. You may never see that person again. You may never return to that place again. Yet inside your mind, the psychological structure connected to it is still being kept alive through your present reactions. One of the strange paradoxes of the mind is that it often returns to what is familiar, even when the familiar is painful. Familiarity creates a kind of false safety. The ego tends to prefer what it already knows rather than step into the uncertainty of what it does not know. A familiar sadness, a familiar story about the past, even a familiar feeling of abandonment can become a psychological shelter. It is like an old room that is damp, dim, and worn down. Yet because someone has lived there for so long, they begin to believe it is the only place they can exist. For that reason, letting go does not begin by forcing yourself to forget. It also does not begin by trying to think more positively. Letting go begins with a very subtle shift in consciousness. When a memory appears, you notice that it has appeared. But this time you do not continue down the old path. You do not analyze it, you do not accuse yourself again, and you do not construct new theories to explain it. At the same time, you do not try to push it away. You simply see it arise and allow it to pass. In Jungian language, this is the moment when consciousness begins to separate itself from the complex that has been operating inside the psyche. You are not fighting it, but you are no longer cooperating with it either. Jung expressed this principle very clearly. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. This means that if you do not become aware of where your attention is constantly being placed, the mind will continue running along the same old loops. And after a while, those loops begin to feel like destiny. When attention is withdrawn long enough, what once dominated your mind does not vanish like magic. Instead, it begins to lose weight. Like a planet that has lost its gravitational force, the old orbits start to drift apart. The structure that once pulled your entire psychological life around it slowly dissolves in a natural way. And strangely enough, that moment can make people uneasy. Not because they have lost their pain, but because they suddenly realize that the mind can become quiet without clinging to a story. But when the mind begins to withdraw its energy from the old narrative, another truth slowly starts to reveal itself. And that truth goes deeper than memory or emotion. What you have been holding on to may not be the past at all. It may be a role you have lived in for so long that you no longer remember who you are without it. And when the next part unfolds, you will begin to see why recognizing that role can make the process of letting go happen so quickly that even you may be startled by it. Part 2. The persona you mistook for your true self. What surprises many people is that attachment in life rarely points directly at a person or a memory. More often, it clings to a version of ourselves that was formed inside that relationship. Someone may say they miss a former partner, but if you look more closely, what they often miss is the version of themselves who existed when that person was still there. The version that knew it had a role, knew it was needed, knew it had a place in someone else's story. When that role disappears, the emptiness does not appear only in the outer world. It also appears inside the structure of identity itself. Carl Jung called this layer of structure the persona, the psychological mask that each person gradually builds in order to adapt to the world. The persona helps us become someone society can accept, the reliable one, the strong one, the one who sacrifices, the one who understands. Jung did not see the persona as a problem in itself. His warning was much more precise. The problem begins when a person forgets that they are wearing a mask. When the mask attaches so tightly that it begins to feel like skin, people start to believe that it is their real face. Jung expressed this very simply. The persona is the mask or appearance one presents to the world. Once the boundary between the mask and the real person becomes blurred, the ego begins to defend that role as if it were defending its very existence. This phenomenon is not merely theoretical, In the lives of many famous figures, we can clearly see the tension between persona and the deeper self. Marilyn Monroe is a striking example. The world saw an icon of beauty and glamour, a radiant symbol of Hollywood. But behind that image was Norma Jean, a person shaped by vulnerability and pain, very different from what the public expected. Over time, the distance between the persona Marilyn Monroe and the real woman grew wider and wider, like an actor forced to keep performing the same role even after the curtain has fallen. When someone lives too long inside the image, the world demands from them. They slowly lose the feeling of who they are when the lights go out. The role remains, but the one playing it begins to fade. In everyday life, this mechanism unfolds more quietly, but it is no less powerful. Some people become used to the role of the one who carries everything in the family. Some live inside the role of the one who must always be kind. Others grow accustomed to the role of the one who cannot fail. At first, these roles function like a coat that helps us step into the world and stand among others. But if the coat is worn for too long, it begins to cling to the skin. When a relationship ends or a familiar environment changes, the panic people feel is not only about losing an external situation. The deeper panic comes when the coat that once defined them is suddenly pulled away, and they realize they are no longer certain who they are without that role. Many attachments in life are not really attachments to other people. They are attachments to the version of ourselves we were allowed to become while that person was present. Someone may not only grieve a relationship, but also the feeling of being important in someone else's life. Someone may not only grieve a job, but also the image of, I am a successful person that the job once provided. In Jungian terms, the first step in separating from the persona is not to destroy it. The persona still has its place. What matters is seeing it clearly. When you recognize, this is the role of the one who must always be strong, or this is the role of the one who must keep everything together, a small inner distance appears between you and the mask. That distance is similar to an actor stepping slightly away from the character they have been playing. The distance may seem small, but its meaning is immense. The ego is only a small part of the entire psyche. When a role collapses, it is not the end of the self. It is more like the old skin of a snake beginning to crack. The snake does not die when the old skin falls away. It is simply preparing for a new form. And when someone finally sees that many of their life choices came from the need to preserve a mask rather than from inner freedom, the process of letting go often accelerates. What once appeared as love, duty, or even destiny may reveal itself as the ego's effort to protect a familiar image of itself. Yet even when a person begins to see through that mask, another force often remains. It quietly pulls them back into the old pattern. It is not mysterious or dramatic. It is something very ordinary, something deeply human, and in many cases it is stronger than people expect. Part 3. The unconscious habit loops sustaining attachment. The force that pulls people back into old loops does not lie in memory, and it does not lie in emotion either. It lives in the small repetitions of daily life, the behaviors repeated so many times that they sink below awareness and become the unconscious structure of a person's day. Carl Jung saw this very early. He believed that human beings are rarely guided by pure rational thought. What truly directs behavior is the need for psychological safety. And the thing that provides the strongest sense of safety is often not truth, but familiarity. Habit works like deep grooves on a dirt road. Each time a wheel passes through, the groove becomes a little deeper. After a while, The car almost slides into that groove on its own, even if the driver is no longer paying attention. Psychological life works in much the same way. A familiar hour of the day, an old piece of music, a certain way of speaking to yourself, even a particular kind of tiredness that arrives at the end of the evening. All of these can become small rituals that keep an emotional structure alive. That is why many people believe they are being held by memory, while in reality what holds them is the old rhythm of life still repeating itself. Imagine a woman named Eleanor. She is 41 and works as an HR manager in a large company. After her 13-year marriage ended, Eleanor told herself she wanted to move on. Yet every evening, after work, she still sits in the same chair by the window and plays the same songs the two of them used to listen to. She does not do it deliberately. It is simply habit. But that habit functions like a hidden door inside the mind. Each time the door opens, the same emotional atmosphere quietly enters the room again. Jung once suggested that repeated suffering often does not persist because memories are powerful, but because present life still maintains the structures that allow those memories to return. In Eleanor's case, the problem is not the past itself. The problem is that the rhythm of her present life is still rebuilding the past every day. Carl Jung once wrote a very direct line: "Neurosis is always a substitute for legitimate suffering." Human beings often accept a familiar form of pain to avoid walking through the real pain of change. An old habit, even one that exhausts us, still offers a sense of control. Breaking a familiar loop, on the other hand, creates a space that feels deeply uncomfortable. That space is like stepping out of a room you have lived in for many years. The light outside may be wider and clearer, but for the first few minutes, your eyes still struggle to adjust. If at this point you begin to recognize a few loops in your own life, take a second to press like on this video. Not for the algorithm, but because that small action can mark a psychological moment. It is a quiet signal to yourself that you are starting to see the patterns that once operated unconsciously. The truth is that attachment does not survive only because emotions are strong. It survives because the rhythm of life remains unchanged. As long as the old structure of the day stays the same, old emotions will always have a road back into the mind. But when a habit is interrupted, the body often reacts before the mind does. Many people feel restless, disoriented, or strangely empty. That does not mean they are on the wrong path. It means an old structure is losing its authority. Each time you resist returning to the familiar reflex that once soothed you, the nervous system begins to learn something new. What is unfamiliar is not necessarily dangerous. In Jungian psychology, every genuine inner rebirth passes through a period of confusion like this. The new cannot emerge, while the mechanisms of the old remain fully intact. And once a new rhythm of life slowly begins to form, many people notice something surprising. The thing they once believed was impossible to release gradually loses its weight. Not because they became stronger than it, but because they stopped building a daily stage where it could continue to appear. Part 4. Environments that keep the old ego pattern alive. Human beings do not live separated from the physical world. The psyche is always anchored to concrete structures. A familiar kitchen, the table where you once waited for a message, the road you still walk every morning, the cafe where you once sat for hours thinking about the same story. These places function like containers of the unconscious. They hold not only memories, but also bodily states. The way you breathe, the way your shoulders drop, the way you fall silent in order to endure something. The moment you return to them, the nervous system almost automatically adjusts itself back to the old frequency before conscious thought even has time to react. Jung often emphasized that the psyche operates within a living network of symbols, and repeated environments are part of that network. This explains why many people say, "I've tried so hard, yet I keep returning to the same state." The problem is not weak willpower. The real issue is that they are trying to form a new self within the same setting that once shaped the old one. It is like trying to change a play while leaving the stage, the lighting and the props exactly as they were. The actor may wish to perform differently, but everything around them keeps pulling them back into the familiar role. In the lives of many well-known figures, we can also see clearly how powerful an environment can be in shaping inner life. After her devastating accident, Frida Kahlo spent years confined to a room where her bed became the center of her world. Yet that very space became the place where she began painting the portraits that explored her inner life so deeply. This example is not meant to suggest that people need tragedy in order to change. The point lies elsewhere. The spaces we inhabit always influence how the mind operates. When an old environment is no longer wide enough for the person you are becoming, you usually face only two possibilities. Either you transform that space so it reflects your new self, or you step out of it. Most of the time, there is no third option. There are places that do not hurt you in any obvious way, yet every time you enter them, you become smaller. Your voice lowers. Your energy drops. You quietly return to the version of yourself that once endured something there. This is often a sign that the environment is still holding an unconscious record of who you used to be. Jung once expressed the spirit of this idea very clearly. The shoe that fits one person pinches another. A form of life that once suited you in an earlier stage can later become a shoe that is too tight. Yet many people continue forcing themselves to remain inside that shoe and call the pain destiny. Leaving in this sense does not necessarily mean moving houses or leaving a city. Sometimes it simply means no longer returning to a place that drains your energy. It may mean changing the corner of your home where you work, choosing a different walking route, or altering a daily rhythm that once revolved around waiting for something that never arrived. These changes may appear small, but they open a crack in the unconscious structure. When the environment changes, the old reflexes lose their support, and the ego is forced to reposition itself within a new context. According to Jung, every deep transformation carries the quality of a symbolic ritual. Stepping out of an old space is a form of crossing the threshold. You no longer belong entirely to the old structure, yet you are not fully at home in the new one either. What often shocks people is that the most frightening moment is not when they leave, but when they realize how much lighter they feel after leaving. That lightness forces them to admit that they had been carrying a weight that no longer belonged to them, simply because they had remained in the room that kept holding it. And when the environment no longer calls you back into the old thoughts, the old roles, and the old emotions, letting go begins to happen almost naturally, not through force of will, but the way an old skin separates from the body once it has finished serving its purpose. Yet when that skin falls away, something else appears that often confuses people even more than the pain they once carried, a completely new emptiness within the mind. Part 5. The void that appears when the ego loses its anchor. This emptiness is not the same as ordinary loneliness. It feels more like a wall in a house you have lived in for many years, suddenly being torn down. Light floods in, but at the same time, you realize that the familiar place where you used to lean your back is no longer there. Many people call this state emptiness. But in Jung's language, it is often a sign that an old psychological structure is being dismantled to make room for a deeper one. What makes this moment frightening is not the loss of something outside. What makes it frightening is that you no longer have anything to shield yourself from your own inner life. Before this, life always provided anchors, someone to care about, a role through which you proved your worth, a goal that kept you busy moving forward. These anchors were like stakes driven into the seabed to keep a boat from drifting. When one stake after another is pulled out, the boat begins to move. It does not drift toward a clear destination. It drifts into waters you have never truly looked at before. This is where what Jung called the shadow begins to appear more clearly. The shadow is not only what we consider bad. In Jung's framework, the shadow includes every part of ourselves that we once refused to live or acknowledge. It can be anger that was suppressed for years in order to maintain the image of being the understanding one. It can be envy we felt ashamed to admit. It can be vulnerability, the need to be loved, or the exhaustion of always having to appear strong. But the shadow can also contain strengths that were neglected, the ability to set boundaries, the right to be a little selfish, or the desire to live life in a way that is truly our own. Many people believe they are suffering because they lost someone, but if you look more closely, what they actually fear is the feeling of being alone with themselves once there is no longer anyone to stay busy for. When there is no one left to prove your worth to, no one left to rescue, no one left to blame, the mind turns inward. And when it turns inward, existential questions begin to appear. If I no longer hold that role, then who am I? If I stop trying to be needed, where does my value come from? If I stop chasing other people's validation, will I become invisible? These questions often push people to fill the emptiness immediately. They look for a new relationship, a new project, a new goal, or a new narrative about themselves. But Jung warned that this reflex is simply another form of avoidance. He wrote very clearly about this. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. In other words, inner growth does not come from trying to convince yourself that everything is fine. It comes from having the courage to look directly at the darker parts of yourself. What Jung meant here was not that we should drown in suffering. His point was simpler than that. When fear appears, you do not have to extinguish it immediately. Let it remain in awareness for a moment. There is no need to overanalyze it. There is no need to judge yourself. Simply recognize that this is a part of your psyche asking to be seen. Think about a story I once heard from a woman named Rebecca. Rebecca was 42 years old, a successful lawyer in Boston. After spending 20 years living as the woman who keeps everything under control, her marriage ended. In the first few weeks, she did not cry as much as she expected. What unsettled her most was a strange feeling that appeared every evening. There was no one left to take care of, no one left to argue with, no one left to prove that she was right. She said her apartment felt like a house where the lights had just been switched off after a long party. Everything was still there, but the energy was gone. During a therapy session, she read a passage from Jung suggesting that many of the things we obsess over in others are actually parts of ourselves we have not accepted. Rebecca began to realize that what frightened her was not loneliness. What frightened her was the loss of the role of the one who must keep everything together. When that role fell away, she had to face a level of exhaustion she had hidden from herself for years. This is the turning point of transformation. When someone has the courage to remain in that emptiness long enough, the shadow gradually loses its need to shout through anxiety obsession, or repetitive behaviors. Because at last, it has been seen. The energy that was once used to suppress, to maintain an image, to perform a role, begins to release itself. In Jungian psychology, this is the moment when psychic energy begins returning to the center of the psyche, rather than being scattered outward. And when that energy starts returning to its center, something else begins to form. Not immediately, not dramatically, but very real. A new inner axis slowly emerges within the person. An axis that no longer depends on clinging to someone, clinging to a role, or clinging to an old story. And once that axis begins to take shape, letting go can happen with a speed that even you may find surprising. Because at that point, what once held you no longer has a center left to hold on to. Part 6. Confronting the shadow behind your attachment. When this new inner axis begins to form, the process of letting go can happen so quickly that even you may be surprised by it. Because at that point, the thing that once held you back no longer has a center to attach itself to. But for this axis of life to truly stand on its own, Jung believed a person must pass through a step that many people avoid, facing their own shadow directly. In psychological life, the shadow is like the bottom of a lake. As long as the surface of the water is full of waves, busy with other people, busy with roles, busy with proving something, the bottom of the lake never becomes visible. But when the water grows still, what lies underneath begins to appear. Jung did not see this as a problem. He saw it as a necessary condition for human growth. The shadow does not only contain what we might call bad parts. It contains every part of ourselves that has been pushed out of awareness because it did not fit the image we tried to maintain. The anger of someone who has learned to endure. The exhaustion of someone who has always had to be strong. The need to be loved in someone who has spent years being the one others lean on. Even the strength of a person who was once taught to make themselves smaller in order to be accepted. Think of a very real story about a woman named Caroline. Caroline is a marketing director in London, 39 years old. For years she lived inside the image of the woman who has everything under control. She solved problems for her team, for her family, for her friends. But after a long breakup, Caroline said that what frightened her most was not losing the person she had been with. What frightened her was the first evening in her apartment when no one needed her to be strong anymore. She said the room felt like a stage after the audience had gone home. The lights were still on, the props were still there, but the role no longer had a reason to continue. Her problem turned out to be very simple. For years, she had refused a very basic part of herself, the right to be tired, the right not to rescue anyone, the right not to be strong all the time. That moment did not make her weaker. It made her more real. In Jung's language, many of our reactions in life do not come from our free self, but from complexes. A complex is like a knot of energy inside the psyche. When it is activated, it pulls the ego into old patterns of response. A small sentence from someone can awaken a deep feeling of abandonment from years ago. A single glance can trigger the urge to prove one's worth. When a person begins to see the shadow more clearly, they also begin to see these complexes more clearly. And once they are seen, energy slowly begins to withdraw from them. This is where the process Jung called individuation becomes visible. Individuation is not about adding more identities to yourself. It is more like removing layers of clothing that were never truly yours. Borrowed desires, battles fought just to be seen, automatic reactions to the gaze of others. When energy is no longer spent maintaining these patterns, it begins to gather, and from that gathering, a very different quality of life appears. greater focus, inner order, and a form of discipline that does not come from force, but from clarity. Jung drew a clear distinction between the ego and the self. The ego is the familiar center of consciousness. It constantly defines itself through other people, through success, through failure. The self is deeper. The self is like the axis of a wheel. When a person begins to live closer to the self, they no longer have to spin with every small movement of the outside world. They still feel things. They still respond to life, but they are no longer pulled in every direction by every reaction. This is why letting go sometimes happens so quickly that it surprises even the person experiencing it. It is not because they force themselves to forget faster. It is because they change the center around which their life revolves. When the axis of life is no longer built around pain, around old roles, or around external validation, those things naturally lose their gravitational pull. At this stage, a new kind of loneliness often appears. It is not the loneliness of panic. It is not the feeling of being abandoned. It is the quietness of someone who is no longer living inside the noise of old reactions. A person who needs less proof, makes fewer comparisons, and no longer waits for permission to become who they are. And when energy continues to return in this way, something else begins to happen. A person is no longer only letting go of what exhausted them. They begin to use that energy to build a new source of life from within, a source that no longer depends on the things they once had to cling to in order to survive. Part 7. Reclaiming Psychic Energy and Entering Individuation. Individuation is not a beautiful idea to contemplate in your head. It begins with very concrete things in everyday life. How you use your mornings, where you place your attention, how you allow your body to rest, and how you decide what is worthy of your energy. If something inside you says you have already let go, but your outer life still runs on the same old rhythm, then that change does not yet have a structure strong enough to hold it. The psyche needs form in the same way water needs a vessel. When the vessel has no walls, the water spills in every direction, and nothing can be retained. The first step in this restructuring is creating a life structure that is stable enough to hold energy. Psychological energy cannot accumulate in a life completely driven by impulses, distractions, or days that drift without rhythm. When sleep, waking, movement, and periods of focused attention begin to take on a clear shape, the psyche becomes like a garden with a fence around it. The fence is not there to imprison the garden, but to protect the seeds that are trying to grow inside. In Jungian terms, discipline is not the suppression of the self. It is more like repairing the plumbing system of an old house. If the pipes are leaking everywhere, the water will never flow with enough force to nourish the whole house. The second step is directing energy into a long-term process. When a person steps out of old obsessions, an empty space usually appears. If that space is not filled with a creative process, the psyche easily falls back into old loops. This is why many people begin learning a skill, building work that requires depth, or dedicating years to a field that demands patience. This is not about proving anything to the world. It is more like redirecting electricity from a short-circuited wire into a new system. The energy that once fed obsession begins to feed creation. Instead of circling endlessly around memory, it slowly accumulates as capability. The third step is protecting energy from fragmentation. In modern life, the psyche is easily pulled into many small pieces. Endless streams of information, conversations that only exist to fill silence, and the reflex to constantly check what is happening around us slice attention into thin layers. When this happens, A person may feel busy all the time, but rarely feels deeply alive. Jung viewed this fragmentation as a form of energy leakage. If someone tries to build an inner life, while constantly allowing their attention to be pulled in every direction, it is like trying to build a house on ground that is being dug up again and again. The fourth step is the most difficult. When a person no longer lives to impress, to attract attention, or to maintain a certain image in the eyes of others, the ego often feels as if it is fading. In this stage, many people believe they are becoming less interesting. But what is actually happening is that energy is no longer flowing outward in search of feedback. It begins to return inward, like heat returning to the core of a fire. When a flame is no longer blown outward by the wind, it burns deeper. From that point, a very clear shift begins to appear in daily life. The things that once created strong stimulation no longer feel as compelling. Drama, comparison, and the need to prove something to others slowly lose their gravity. In their place, people begin to prefer things that are more enduring. They begin to prefer clarity over noise, depth over agitation, and long processes over immediate reactions. It is similar to a river finally rediscovering its main channel after years of spilling into many shallow branches. Then one ordinary day arrives, without any dramatic moment announcing it. You simply notice that the thing which once occupied your entire mind now feels like an old room in a house where you have moved to live on another floor. You know the room still exists, but you no longer live there. And in that moment, a quiet realization appears. What once held you was never as powerful as you thought. It only seemed powerful because all of your energy was flowing toward it. When that current of energy returns to your own center, the cords that once tied you begin to fall away very quickly, sometimes so quickly that even you are surprised by the sudden lightness inside your own mind. Previously, your life was organized around a wound, a role, a relationship, or an image you held about yourself. Now your life begins to organize itself around a different center, one that is deeper and quieter. When the axis of your life shifts, the things that once carried so much weight begin to lose their pull. You no longer need to fight them, and you no longer need to force yourself to forget. They slowly move away from the center, like objects drifting out of orbit after gravity has changed. Many people believe that letting go must be a strong decision, a clear declaration, or a dramatic moment of final closure. But in reality, the deepest changes rarely happen that way. They happen much more quietly. It is like a river changing its course after flowing through the same valley for many years. Once a new riverbed forms, the water naturally follows it. Human life works in a similar way. When psychological energy begins to organize itself around awareness, around honesty with oneself, and around a steadier inner axis, what no longer belongs simply falls away from life. Not because you have become colder, but because you no longer need to cling to those things in order to know who you are. If while listening to this you recognize that you have also held onto a story in your mind for far too long, you can share that experience in the comments. Naming what we have lived through is sometimes the first step that allows consciousness to see what has been sitting in the dark for so long. And if content like this helps you understand the human psyche and the journey of individuation more clearly, you can subscribe to the channel to continue exploring the deeper layers of the mind through the perspective of Carl Jung. Perhaps the most striking part of this entire journey is the feeling that appears after letting go. It is not completely relief, and it is not exactly sadness either. It is a very unusual feeling, like stepping out of a room you have lived in for too long and suddenly realizing how wide the air outside really is. That moment reveals something simple but profound. Letting go is not losing a part of life. Letting go is the moment you finally return to the part of life that has always belonged to you.